a gunslinger, a cannibal, and a Wild West serial killer whose exploits earned him the name the Kentucky Cannibal. Today we're taking a look at the vicious and depraved life of a Wild West outlaw and the murder and mayhem he brought with him everywhere he went. This is the gruesome tale of Boone Helm. Born Levi Boone Helm in 1828 in Lincoln County, Kentucky, to a respectable, honest, and hard-working family, nothing about Helm's early upbringing would give any indication to the ruthless and bloodthirsty man he would turn out to be. His family, 12 siblings included, eventually moved to the Jackson Township in Monroe County, Missouri, where he was raised on the borderland between civilization and what was seen as the savage frontier. It was here that at a young age, he started to make a name for himself as a nuisance to the community. As a teenager, Helm amused himself by challenging men in the area to fights, where he would show off his great strength, which he had even at a young age. He also would prove his impressive agility by taking his Bowie knife and throwing it into the ground before he would ride his horse at a full gallop and scoop it up from the ground, all while managing to stay on his horse. One story says that while Helm was on horseback, the sheriff arrived to arrest him for his shenanigans and fighting, and in his anger at the sheriff's audacity, Helm rode away from him and to the courthouse. Once there, even though the circuit court was in session, Helm walked his horse right up the stairs and into the courtroom, where he lectured the judge for sending the sheriff after him. Some people think that Helm may have been drunk at the time, but honestly, he was always misbehaving like this, even as a teen, and alcohol may not have actually been a factor. That or he was usually drinking, and this was all normal behavior for him. In 1851, a 20-year-old Helm got married to Lucinda Frances Browning, who was 17 at the time. Together, the two had a daughter they named Lucy. As an adult, Helm was making it clear he wasn't a good guy and was known to always be heavily drinking. Part of his drinking was beating his wife and riding his horse into the house just as he had done with the courthouse. Lucinda eventually decided she had enough of his anger, stealing, and the fact that he'd spent almost all their money on liquor. Lucinda petitioned to divorce Helm, and some sources add the disturbing detail that she may have been severely hurt by Helm first. His father came to his rescue, though, and helped him pay for the cost of his divorce from Lucinda, which ultimately made his family go bankrupt. Along with taking all his family's money, Helm also ruined their reputation with his antics and divorce. In a move that seems like he was trying to run away from his problems and shame, Helm decided this was a good time to move to California in 1850 in order to look for gold, as the great gold craze had just started. Once he realized that going to California seemed like a good idea, Helm asked his cousin, Littlebury Shute, to join him, who agreed to the adventure. At some point, Shute changed his mind, though, and told Helm he wasn't going to come and wanted to remain in Missouri. Hearing this, Helm's angry and violent reputation got the better of him. In a rage, he stabbed Shute in the chest, possibly with his Bowie knife, which killed him immediately. Without a companion to join him, Helm still went west. Much of his community was more than happy to see him leave. But Helm's problems wouldn't remain behind him. Hearing about his murder, Shute's brother and friends pursued Helm and even managed to capture him. As soon as he was taken in by the men and put in jail, Helm began acting so strange and crazed that they thought there was something seriously wrong with him. The court found him guilty of Shute's murder, but because of his behavior, they started to have doubts about his sanity, and for the safety of the other prisoners, they sent him to an asylum for the mentally insane. Before sending him away to the asylum, those in the court described Helm by saying, his manner was not only unbecoming, but unbalanced. Was Helm actually insane? Maybe. Some of what he's believed to have done later in his life makes it seem like he may have disregarded human life in a way that was especially shocking, even in the world of the Wild West. We can't know if this disregard for other people was the result of any kind of mental illness, but what is known is that as soon as he arrived, Helm appears to have faked a total breakdown and became taciturn, choosing to speak very little or at all. When he did speak, he convinced the guard tasked with watching him to take him out for walks around the woods surrounding the asylum. The walks with the guards started to become part of Helm's daily routine. As the guards grew to trust Helm, he took advantage and escaped one day during their walk together, even with 3 armed men trying to keep him there. Finally, Helm was able to head west, though much later than he ever planned. Almost as soon as he arrived, Helm once again proved himself to be an all-round bad guy by regularly getting into altercations with other men, often dueling, fighting, and murdering them. The details of these duels and deaths aren't known for sure, and it's not even known exactly how many men Helm killed, but it's believed to be at least several during this part of his life. At first, Helm's kills and gunfights didn't catch too much attention because it was all pretty common for the Wild West. But Helm must have committed at least 1 or 2 pretty brutal murders because he ended up having to flee the gold miners to avoid being arrested for the killings or being attacked in vigilante justice. While on the run, Helm met up with 6 other men who he decided to team up with. It was the middle of winter, and they were in a rugged mountain region headed to Fort Hall, Idaho. For some reason, Helm decided he should be too honest with these men and admitted to them that he had gruesomely eaten parts of, or sometimes all of the men's bodies who he'd killed. He's been quoted as saying to the men, "Many's the poor devil I've killed at one time or another, and the time has been that I've been obliged to feed on some of them." Hearing what a gruesome companion Helm was, I can't imagine welcoming him to join me on an adventure into the woods. It isn't totally clear when Helm claimed to have first eaten someone, except that by this point, he was proudly bragging about doing it more than once. Around this time, some sources say that Helm started to be known as the Kentucky Cannibal, and it was rumored that he preferred to only eat human flesh, which he would cook up over a fire. This, of course, wasn't true, and he didn't only eat human flesh, but even still, sometimes eating people is far too often. Somehow, the men with Helm weren't completely horrified to learn that they were spending their time with a boastful cannibal. Regardless, while the group was on their way heading east to Fort Hall, before heading on to Salt Lake City, they were attacked by a Native American tribe which sent them running to hide in the woods. The problem was they weren't at all equipped to face the wilderness, and the men struggled to survive. They didn't have enough provisions with them when they were sent fleeing for their lives and ended up having to kill their horses to eat. They made good use of the horses' hides and turned them into snowshoes to help them with the journey. Even with the horses' meat, survival wasn't easy, and in the perils of winter, 4 of the men died, leaving only 2 struggling to stay alive: Helm and a man named Burton. Some people think that Helm and Burton resorted to cannibalizing the other 4 men, as Helm had essentially promised them that he would if it came down to it. But it isn't known for sure if they did. The 2 remaining survivors managed to make their way to an abandoned cabin, but once there, Burton was feeling the effects of the treacherous winter and unforgiving wilderness. Sitting in the cabin, Burton was starving, weary, and snowblind, and realized he couldn't go on anymore. He opted to be left behind by Helm, just as they had left their 4 other companions. In his account of what happened next, Helm said that he left Burton and went on to an old stockade, where he also found it abandoned and empty. Realizing there was nothing there for him, he decided to go back to the cabin where he left Burton. Somehow his timing on his return was just right, as while he was outside gathering firewood, he heard Burton use a pistol to take his own life. Or at least that's what Helm claims. I can't help but think there was a chance that Helm turned around with something far more sinister in mind, given what he did upon finding Burton dead. Helm decided to stay in the abandoned cabin with Burton's body. Without any other food, Helm ate one of Burton's legs, and remembering that he previously claimed to have eaten the people he killed when he wasn't actually starving in the wilderness, I don't imagine he found it too difficult. Helm also cut off and wrapped up Burton's other leg to carry with him to keep eating while he completed his journey to safety. As he was the only one of his companions to survive the winter, I can't help but find it a bit suspicious that it was the killer and professed cannibal who was the only one to walk out of the woods alive. Who knows what he may have done in order to survive? Eventually, Helm was found living among a Native American tribe by a man named John Wesley Powell, who was an explorer that would go on to be the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey. Powell later wrote about his encounter with Helm and gave us a vivid description of Helm, saying, "I saw a tall, cadaverous, sunken-eyed man standing over me, dressed in a dirty, dilapidated coat and shirt and drawers, and moccasins so worn that they could scarcely be tied to his feet." Thinking that Helm was in need of aid, Powell offered to take him to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he was already headed. Helm agreed, but even though Powell was offering him help out of the goodness of his heart, Helm never bothered to thank Powell for feeding, clothing, or transporting him. He also didn't offer to pay Powell for his rescue, despite the fact that he had over $1,400 in coins on him at the time. No small amount of money in the mid-1800s, which gives you at least a bit of a clue what kind of guy Helm was. Ungrateful, at least probably by Powell's standards. At some point during their travels together, Helm told Powell about Burton's grisly fate, which the explorer later recorded, saying that Helm had claimed to have cut off, well up in the thigh, Burton's remaining leg. Having already eaten the other, he rolled the limb up in an old red flannel shirt, tied it across his shoulder. It isn't known exactly how Powell felt hearing this story about the last person to travel with Helm, but I imagine he slept with one eye open after that. Once in Salt Lake City, Helm ditched Powell and got up to his old tricks. He spent the enormous sum of money he'd been carrying with him, and some sources say that he even started to work as a Danite for the Mormons. A Danite is a member of a secret association of Mormons who used violent means to destroy their enemies. Helm was hired to kill some of the men they wanted out of their city. But Helm must have upset a lot of people while he was there, because he was shortly once again wanted by the law and no longer welcome as a Danite, sending him fleeing from capture again to California, the place he seemed to think was where someone should go if they've worn out their welcome elsewhere. While once again in California, Helm made friends with a rancher who graciously offered to take him in while he was hiding from the law. The poor rancher clearly had no idea the kind of man he was welcoming into his home, because Helm eventually killed him too, robbing him and went back on the run. It isn't clear exactly why Helm killed the man who offered him aid, but it was clear that he couldn't stay in California any longer. Helm made his way to Oregon, where he started to rob people in order to survive. Frequently, these robberies ended in Helm killing his victims, racking up an even longer list of people he'd murdered. But again, it isn't actually known just how many people Helm killed. In 1862, Helm got into an altercation at a saloon in Florence with a man named Dutch Fred. Fred was known as a fighter, but he hadn't offended Helm or even challenged him to a fight when they got into their altercation. This is probably because Fred was unarmed when Helm approached him. Helm had been drinking heavily, and as Fred stood looking at him directly in the face, he shot him. Technically, Helm's first shot missed Fred, but he took a second shot and killed him in cold blood right in front of everyone at the saloon. A few sources believe that Helm could have maybe shot Fred after being hired by someone else who wanted him dead, because there's no other reason Helm would want to kill him. When Fred died, Helm again had to go on the run, because even this cold-blooded murder was too much for the likes of Florence, even with the crowds of miners there and the fights that often broke out. This time, however, he wasn't alone. He joined up with another fugitive, and they fled together, heading up towards the Fraser River in British Columbia. A story during this trip tells us that Helm and his shady friend decided to try to make some money the good old-fashioned way, by robbing someone. And while in Antler Creek, they targeted a man named Sokolowski and his two French-Canadian associates. The men were said to be carrying $32,000 in coarse gold, which made them a perfect target for the desperate outlaws. Lying in wait for the three men to pass by on the road, Helm and his partner in crime shot at Sokolowski and the others as soon as they saw them. The men returned fire, emptying their pistols, but sadly they were taken off guard and all three were killed. Helm and his partner took the men's gold, burying most of it so they could come back and take it when they weren't on the run from the law, and left the three bodies lying by the road, all with bullets in their heads. Because they did almost nothing to hide their horrendous crime, the bodies were quickly found, and a posse gathered to hunt down those responsible. Helm was once again on the run. Interestingly, following these three murders, the area on the banks of the Caribou River near Quesnel Forks and Likely was given an eerie nickname that it's still remembered by today: Murder Gulch, all thanks to Boone Helm. It's not clear exactly what happened or why, but it's believed that at some point Helm killed and ate the man who was on the run with him as well. When he was later asked about his accomplice, Helm is believed to have said, "Why do you suppose that I'm full enough to starve to death when I can help it? I ate him up, of course." The man, whose name we still aren't sure about, was never found, and the gold that Helm is believed to have buried has still never been found to this day. Soon after this, though, he was captured by the British Columbian authorities while hiding out in Victoria. The local newspaper, The Colonist, wrote that Boone Helm, represented as a bad character, was taken into custody upon a charge of drinking at saloons without settling his score. Brought before the police magistrate, Helm was ordered to pay a $90 bond, which, because he'd buried the gold he stole and hadn't had the chance to go back for it, he was unable to actually pay. Instead, it's believed by some that he spent a month essentially doing community service by building and repairing the city streets in Victoria. As soon as he was released, Helm was on the run again, as he always seemed to be, before he was once again arrested in Fort Yale in the Fraser Canyon, probably trying to go back for his buried gold. It seems that people were fascinated by Helm's exploits, at least in the areas where he visited, as newspapers would update the public on his arrests whenever they had the chance. The Yale newspaper wrote that Helm was brought into the city last night strongly ironed. Helm's conduct on the road is conclusive evidence that he was aware he was being pursued. When overtaken, he was so exhausted by fatigue and hunger that it would have been impossible for him to have continued many hours longer. He was sent back to Florence after being held in Portland for a while until he could finally be tried for the death of Dutch Fred. Instead of actually facing justice, though, Helm's family once again came to his rescue. Helm turned to one of his many siblings, a brother named Old Tex, to help him get out of trouble. Old Tex did more than that. He tracked down all the witnesses set to testify against Helm and paid them each an enormous sum to refuse to speak against him. Without any willing witnesses, Helm couldn't be convicted and had to be released. Or because the people of Florence had already lost interest in his crime, as there were far more recent ones that had their attention. Either way, this time he went with his brother to Texas, where he refused to stay out of trouble and is known to have killed even more people, possibly also cannibalizing them. In another version entirely, Helm apparently managed to escape from captivity in a jail at Port Townsend by digging his way out by going under a wall. From here, he made his way alone to Bannock, Montana. Regardless of how exactly he got away with killing Fred, Helm was once again free. For several years, Helm continued on, bringing mayhem with him and committing even more murders across the states he'd already been. Eventually, Helm decided to join up with the outlaw Henry Plummer, who was sheriff of Bannock and a thief and murderer on the side, and his gang. This turned out to be disastrous. Though they spent time robbing people together, it wouldn't last. Helm, along with other members of the Plummer gang, were all captured and arrested in secret. The men's trial was also conducted in secret, and Helm spent most of it throwing the blame for his crimes on the other men. Apparently, after kissing a Bible, he accused his good friend Three-Fingered Jack Gallagher of being the one to commit all of his own crimes. He even called him all the names in the calendar, telling him he ought to die. Some friend Helm turned out to be. Eventually, Helm admitted to 2 murders, one in Missouri and another in California, but that was it. Despite his adamant attempts to blame everyone for the horror he had inflicted on the West for around 36 years, no one seemed to believe Helm was innocent, probably because he'd made a notorious name for himself. In the 1860s, there was a rise in vigilante justice in Montana, and Helm, Gallagher, and other gang members were all taken by the Montana vigilantes in January 1864 to Virginia City to hang. There are reports that close to 6,000 people came to watch the executions of the outlaws, but this number isn't known for sure. As the men stood waiting for death, Helm is believed to have casually remarked, "I've looked at death in all forms, and I'm not afraid to die." He also told the nervous men at his side to stop making such a fuss. At least Helm was consistent until the end. Gallagher was hanged before Helm, and apparently seeing his friend hanging and struggling, he made the cold comment, "Kick away, old fellow, my turn next. I'll be in hell with you in a minute." But this wasn't the last thing Helm said. Apparently, when the executioner turned to Helm to take away his hangman's box, Helm exclaimed, "Every man for his principles, hurrah for Jeff Davis, let her rip," and jumped right off the box before someone else could kick it away from him, and before his crimes were even read out to the gathered crowd. The Jeff Davis he shouted about had served as the President of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865, so he was still serving when Helm died. An oddly political last statement for a man known to be on the run from the law most of his life. After his execution, the Victoria colonists celebrated by writing, "Hung at last, the notorious Boone Helm, who so long succeeded in escaping the ends of justice, has been lynched, with 12 others at Bannock Mines." Today, Boone Helm's body is buried in the Boot Hill Cemetery in Virginia City. It's believed he killed more than 11 people, with some historians putting this number as high as several dozen murders in the early 1860s alone, never mind throughout his entire life. But with so many myths surrounding him and very little information about the details of his life, we'll likely never know for sure just how many lives Boone Helm took.